Oh. Well, according to my Mickey, it's time to start. I hadn't heard the bell ring yet, but it rang and you was talking. Okay. Yes, I was talking to the Ashleys, everybody that went over there yesterday. I know we had a wonderful time. I did. Tim made fun of how much I ate, but that's okay. Well, my son's got a saying about cooks. This does not apply to you, but he enjoys his food too, and he says, never trust a skinny cook. Because if you enjoy your own food, everybody else is going to enjoy it, right? We are going to be in Matthew chapter 17 when we begin, but it's great to see the Moody's back with us again today. She was knocking on her head. I know that's a symbol for knocking on wood, but she does not have a wooden head. So great to see them. Keep the Halls in our prayers. Tina, Charles, Rosie. Your surgery is still coming up 16th, and Lisa's back in for surgery this week. Terry, is it this week or next? She seemed like it was the 4th or 5th, somewhere around there, for some surgery. Brother Terry, keep him in our prayers. He seems to be doing better on his medicine, but I hadn't talked to him in depth on it yet, so he's just sitting there sort of stone-faced, so I might have not got it right. Sister Dot going through her chemotherapy. Amy, of course, Linda's out with her. Angel's dad and Tim's brother. So we still got just a whole slew of people on the sick and injured list there. So let's keep all of them in our thoughts and prayers. Before we begin our class this morning, Brother Kirk Mayfield, would you lead us in a prayer, please? Going to be in Matthew chapter 17, starting at the end of that chapter. There's some parallels in Matthew and a little bit in Luke, but I'm going to mainly stay in Matthew account. And we're going to start about, where do we start? Verse 24. We're going to start verse 24. Matthew 17 and verse 24. And when they were come to Capernaum, I remember they'd been up north a little bit, but when they'd come into Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? Let's break this verse down. At this time, we're looking historically on a timeline. We're somewhere around 30 AD, plus or minus a few years. You know, I don't get dogmatic on that because the calendar changes, etc. But somewhere around 30 AD, plus or minus. So, at this timeline, who would be the collectors of the tribute, and what would the tribute be used for? I'm sorry? Brother Clont said tax collectors, and what did you say? Caesar. tax collector. It's a temple tax at this time. That's the reason I wanted to specify 30, that we're somewhere around 30 AD, because at this particular time, the ones that were talking and collecting the money, they were using it to support the activities of the temple. Now, when we get to around 70 AD, plus or minus a couple of years, Vespasian changed that where the tribute was to go into the Roman treasury. So there's a little bit of change there, but at the time frame that we're talking about, the ones that come to him are asking him about the temple money. Where do we get the idea that temple money was supposed to be paid anyway? Why did they even want to collect temple money? Weird version of the tithe? Not exactly. Let's go back to Exodus 30 and verse 13. Exodus 30 and verse 13. If somebody would read that. Okay. See, in essence, back in this time, everybody that was of the proper age and everything, they were, it was voluntary in one sense of the word, but it was required that they give that half shekel for the support of the sanctuary, and that's carried over to where we are right now. Where it differs from the tithe is that what is required of the tithe. That was basically 10% of all the first stuff that goes, but this was in addition to the tithe. But then in verse 25, he, meaning Peter, answered and said, yes. Where it said, does your master pay tribute? Here, Peter answers him and said, yes. Now there's an interruption, because when he came into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, the word prevented here is what we would consider today. It's an archaic word. It was used when the King James Bible was written, and that's the version that I prefer. But what does the word prevent today, if we were changing the terminology, what would prevent mean today? Prevent means stop, but if we were using modern language, what word would we substitute for that today? And okay, how about preceding? Okay, another word for it is precede or precede, mean go in front of. So here, when Peter answered and said, yes, he gives tribute, Christ then spoke in front of Peter, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon, of whom, what thinkest thou, Simon, of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute, of their own children or of strangers? Peter said unto him, of strangers. And Jesus said unto him, they are the children free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, and before I go into this part, what Peter had actually said here when they had answered, does your master pay tribute? And he said, yes. That was a blanket statement, meaning he pays everything that's required. Now, that's both tribute to the sanctuary and to Caesar, as some of you had mentioned. So is there a lesson in that for us today? Do we pay taxes that we don't like to pay? Not necessarily because of the amount, but I detest the fact that my tax dollars go to Planned Parenthood, which is nothing but an abortion mill. I detest my tax money going to support these other states that do things that I don't agree with, your sanctuary cities, your pot, and you can go on and on and on with it. But as a Christian, can I refuse to pay my tax and still be a Christian? You've been erring one. To be a Christian in good standing, if we want to use that phrase, even though we don't like it, if Caesar requires it, we have to do it. Now, to some, that leaves a bad taste in their mouth. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I wish there was something I could do about it, but I can't. So, and I think that's the lesson we have here. Peter said, yes, he does. Because when we get to verse 27, Christ is talking again, and he says, notwithstanding, lest we should offend them. So at this point, they hadn't given any tribute money to support the temple, but Christ says, so we don't offend anybody, you go to the sea, cast a hook, take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee. So whatever was going to happen, however that money came about, they were going to get the money and give to the temple, give to the tribute collectors, and it was going to be enough for the both of them, so that they wouldn't offend anybody. Why did he use the word offend in here? So that we don't offend them. He didn't want to be if you want to look, Brother Terry said he didn't want to do anything that might cause them then not to do that. So we call that a stumbling block. He didn't want to be a stumbling block. He didn't want a precedence for others. He wanted everybody to do their thing. Today, a lot of people, when they go visit other congregations, when the collection plate is passed, they don't put anything in it. Others, when they're visiting other congregations, do put something in it. What's right and what's wrong? Or is there a right or a wrong? If somebody visits this congregation, well, let me just back up and start it this way. Who is supposed to support the work of this congregation? The local members. When Andrew and I go visiting, it's just been our habit that we don't put anything in the collection plate of when it's passed, but when we return or sometime before we leave, the money goes here. We did contribute, even though we were not here. Some just feel like it, well, I don't want to seem out of place. I don't want to. So they'll put in a dollar or two just to show that they've done something. But there is no right or wrong as long as you are continuing to. Now, if you go away on vacation and you come back and you've used that vacation time as an excuse not to contribute at your home congregation, then you're in error, because you're supposed to lay by and store how often? Right. So just because you're not here on that particular day, that does not excuse you from your duty or your responsibility. But that does not mean that you need to put anything in at the visiting congregation. If you do, you can support their work as long as you give. It really comes down to it. But that's the reason you are attached to a local congregation, is for the support of that work. Brother, you had your hand up, and I was on a roll. So yes. Okay. Correct. That says it. Exactly. Don't put a stumbling block in anybody's way. Yes, ma'am. Correct. That is absolutely correct. I'm sure everybody in here has made that mistake, and you look at the sign on the wall and you think you're going to a place that's nice and solid, but when the preaching is done or when the activities are done, you find out that I wish I'd have gone someplace else. So you don't want to support that work. We've also been to congregations where the bulletin, on the bottom of the bulletin, there was a statement that says we do not require or expect or whatever it was our visitors to contribute. Same way with here. We don't expect, we don't require, we don't judge, we don't look at visitors who don't put anything in because, again, it's whose responsibility? Ours. Questions or comments on this section of tribute? Thought there'd be a lot of talk. Getting into chapter 18, it says, the same time the disciples came unto Jesus, saying, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, why did they ask that question? To give us something to talk about? Remember our timeline. What had taken place shortly before this? Transfiguration. Who was at the transfiguration? Peter, James, and John. Go back a little ways. What happened prior to that? Christ said, upon this rock I will build my church. Who was present there? Who was singled out, so to speak, there? Peter. Not that it was going to be built on Peter, not that Peter was going to be the one in charge, but here Peter was the sort of the focus. Now Peter, James, and John. So they're getting down to it. And why do they ask that question? These things are taking place, and it looks like, well, in their mind, why are they trying to make a distinction about rank? Well, it would be that Christ is not going, they don't exactly know that. He's told them, but they don't, that hadn't soaked in yet. But they are still thinking the way earthlings think. They're still thinking about earthly kingdoms. And they're wanting to make sure of their pecking order. Somebody go to Matthew 20. We're going to jump ahead just a little bit. Matthew 20, verse 20 and 21. Matthew 20, 20 and 21. Okay, now here's a mother. Now, moms always want the best for their children, no doubt about that. But did she have a good understanding of what was going to take place? Because now she's wanting her two kids in a more prominent place. Who is going to be in the prominent place in heaven? Huh? There's the Godhead, there's the angels, there's the rest of us. So as we're going to go along here, we're going to find out that that's the teaching that he's going to come to. But do you find it interesting? Well, this is just a bit of trivia that I've always looked at and thought it kind of interesting. Who are the sons that she's talking about? James and John. Who was the first apostle killed. James, who was the last apostle to die? John, his brother. Is there any significance to her question and that they boxed in the dying of the apostles? Just a food for thought, something to think about. But then verse 2, Jesus called a little child unto him and set him in the midst of them. Now, the child could be anything from a toddler on up to a little bit older, because when Jesus called the child to him, child had to be old enough to understand a little something. And he said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. That is a most important statement. What was he talking about that you be converted and be as little children? Children have no sin, and what else about children? Sorry? They're very forgiving. Something else. They're innocent. Something else. They're humble. Do children have, do most children have ambition the way that we think of ambition today? Most children, they are sharing, caring, and all they want to do is go out and intermingle and have fun. They're not trying to step up that corporate ladder or stand on anybody's head. They're not trying to make that. So when Christ is telling them here that you have to be converted and be as little children, he's telling them that they have to, based on the question that was just asked, who's the greatest? He comes back and says, you got to forget that. You got to let go of your ego. You've got to be innocent. You've got to be humble. You've got to be all these things. There's a poem by a fellow by the name of Saadi, S-A-A-D-I, that lived in about the 1200s. And I had to write it down so that I would make sure I got it right. But to me, that poem fits everything exactly. He says, the hearts of infants being free from avarice. Anybody know what the word avarice means? I'm sorry? Greed. So the hearts of infants being free from avarice, what care they for a handful of silver more than for a handful of dust? See, I think that puts it in just nails it to what he's talking about. A little kid out there playing. Do they know the difference between a penny and a dollar, silver dollar? I'll guarantee you that you go and take the children that's probably in the age group that he's talking about here, that's old enough to understand the terms come, but not old enough to. You lay 5 pennies in front of them and say you can have this or you can have this and put one silver dollar. What are they going to go for? Numbers, 5 pennies. That's to them more. Totally don't care. Does that make sense? Verse 4 then says, whoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. What does the word humble or humble mean? Christ is the perfect example. What did Christ do? No ego, but what did he do? Remember when he got fussed at for washing feet? What king is going to wash feet? What boss do you know of up the corporate ladder that's going to be the servant? and serve. And that's the message he's trying to get across here, is that in this, well, let's take this congregation, for instance, that everybody in here has a different role, but who is more important than the other? Nobody. Every role is important. Verse 5, and whosoever shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. So, again, if you treat the visitor or the little child good, it's the same as if you received Christ and treated him good. That message is in another section also, talking about food and clothing and taken care of and other things. But then at verse 6 says, but whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. Seems like Brother Joel touched on that a little bit Wednesday night, wasn't it? About the millstone. Have any of you heard the term parricide? Know what parricide means? What is one of the commandments in the Old Testament about how children are supposed to treat their parents? Pardon? Honor your parents. Do good to them. Parricide is just a fancy word that means that people kill their parents. Something that you're shaking your head. Did I get that wrong? Or huh? Okay. Well, I'm hoping I pronounced it right. Parricide. Okay. Anyway, it was customary during this time frame in different cultures that if someone were to kill their parents, that they would have a heavy object put around them and drowned. So this is where this saying comes from. That was one manner of execution back in those days. Now, as Brother Joel touched on Wednesday night, the millstone, everybody knows what a grist mill is, so it's the grinding stones, upper and lower. Everybody thinks of those as being huge and having to be pulled either by a water mill or several people or animals. But they also, back in those days, made them for household use. So they were a little smaller. They were still weighty, but they were smaller. So it doesn't necessarily infer here that when a millstone was hung about that it was one of the 300 pounders. It could have been a 25 pound. But if you put a 25-pound stone around your neck and get thrown in the water, how long is it going to take you to drown? How many people can swim to the surface with a 25-pound rock in their hand? Not many. Huh? So, questions or comments? Yes, sir. I, in a manner of speaking, I believe it could. If you look at some and let's use the word church in a generic sense right now. Uh, I believe personally that in a lot of churches that there are people who want to be prominent, and they will do things to set themselves apart and be up here. How many preachers do you know of today that preach because they love to preach and that's what they want to do? Yes, they get paid, but the amount they get paid, they would take that or more. They're not interested in the pay part. They're interested in the preaching and teaching part. Versus, how many can you look out and see that want to make a name for themselves and are doing it for the uh, notoriety versus the just wanting to spread the gospel? Can you think of any of those? When I start thinking of them, now don't get me wrong, there are some out there who want to do it for the truth and they write books, but you look at those out there who write books and go on TV and other things because they are like the old rooster, they like to be a little puffed up. Uh, I think that's one of the great dangers in a church today, in a congregation, and that's one of the reasons I think when congregations are looking to appoint elders and deacons, it says not a novice. Well, why is the word not a novice in there? Why is it in there that they're not to do it for filthy lucre or money? Uh, and there's a great danger sometimes of people thinking that those two roles are more political, more uh, personal. I can't think of the word I'm looking for right now. But it's not for them to be workers. It's for them to just be. I'm sorry. Seen. That would work. So I think that's a danger that we run into today. That sometimes when we appoint somebody to a position that way, uh, there is that element of danger if they're not well grounded and we don't do our job correctly, that it sort of goes to their head and they get a little bit puffed up. So that's one of the things that we really got to be careful of. Verse 7, woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe unto that man by whom the offense cometh. When I read that verse, it tells me that it is inevitable that bad things are going to happen. Does that mean that God planned them? Nope. But he's just letting them know that bad things are going to happen. But woe to that man by whom the offense comes. This rolls back to the previous verse, and Brother Joel was trying to uh, layer it there so it would be for those causing offenses and all, that do a little separation. And I guess you could look at it this way, that if we put a stumbling block in front of someone and cause them to be lost, when we face judgment, what's going to be our excuse? What's going to be our plea that we can make it through the door? Are we innocent of that? You know, there's a phrase in the Bible, am I my brother's keeper? Yeah. So if I cause someone to stumble and fall and be on the lost path, we'll get into this a little bit later about forgiving sins and all, but what is my responsibility? to help get them going the right way. I'm supposed to go to them and do whatever I did wrong. I got to make amends. What if I can't make amends? What if they will not allow the amends to be made? Where am I? If I have done my absolute best to make amends, I'm okay. But if they will not accept me trying to make amends and I walk away with my back turned and say, well, forget you, where am I? I'm back down there in that lost category. See, my mind's still got to be right. My mind has got to be forgiving. My mind has got to be doing what I can do to save that person. So, it sure can. Verse 8, wherefore if thy hand or thy foot offend thee, cut them off and cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life halt or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. Well, you know right offhand by reading this verse that it is not talking about physical. Because if you look at it, it says it is better to enter life. What life are we talking about? We're already alive, or else we wouldn't be using the phrase cut off body parts. So we're talking about the eternal life, the spiritual life. So this is just a way of saying this is what you need to do. And if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with one eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire. Physically, there's not a hell fire that we're going to get in. Spiritually, we're either going to reside in heaven with God or we're going to be cast into the lake of fire. So, and using body parts, you got to go to the one that talks about all the body parts being different, but each one of them being important. They all need to work together. So here on a spiritual basis is that you have to cast off, get rid of anything that stands in your way spiritually and anything that stands in your way of helping others spiritually to get where we all want to go. Uh, Comments, questions? Uh, I can tell you a personal story along those same lines. If Andrea won't get mad at me, her mother and father, after 38 years of marriage or somewhere in that neighborhood, divorced, and her mother started living with another man. Uh, he had been an elder in the church. When they came, your dad, yeah, her dad had been an elder in the church, so they were very knowledgeable in the Bible. The other guy was a scoundrel. Let's just put it like it is. But she was living with him. They weren't even married. We would not let our kids go spend. We would go visit them, but we would not let our kids spend the night. When they come to visit us, they could not sleep indoors. They brought their RV, but they'd want to share the bed, and we wouldn't do that in front of our kids. So sometimes you have to make those calls, but we never. but we never treated them in any manner other than we love you, but we don't like your lifestyle. Brother Terry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's just like she was talking about it. It gets real personal when it gets down to family. But a Christian, well, I sort of look at things as black and white. I try to eliminate the gray. And if you're a Christian, what this book says takes precedence over everything else. So there's no wiggle room in here. You're either right or you're wrong. So, our situation, what would we have been teaching our kids if we had allowed them to spend the night with her mother and her fellow she was living with when they're not married and they go to one bed? And what message are we teaching our young folks if we had done that? And that's one of the several other things along those lines. But you've got to be firm in your conviction. You got to stand with the Bible. That does not mean that you have to have a hard heart or be harsh or ill. Mm-hmm. Brother Golden, I think you had your hand going up. No? Yeah. Uh, I've told this story repeatedly, but when I fished a lot, the fishing club I was in, they was going to have a Sunday night tournament, and they was getting ready to name times and places, and they named the start time, and I said, "Is it okay if me and my partner get up there and launch at 9?" And they said, "Why can't you make it at 6?" And I said, "Going to be at church." And instead of saying, "Yeah, it's okay for you to come at 9," he looked around and said, "Is there any objection to just starting at 9 o'clock?" So they changed their whole start time because they knew I was not going to be. They didn't do it for me, I don't think. Well, maybe they did, but I wasn't that important to the whole club. But when they were being cooperative, when they said, "Well, we'll accommodate you," I think is more the way it went. But instead of just accommodating me, they just changed for everybody. Brother Joel, you had your hand up too. Yes, sir. Thank everybody for your attention and your comments, Brother Terry. Correct. I meant to get a little farther. I left you a lot of work to do Wednesday night, Brother Terry. So thank y'all again.